Yes.
Yeah.
And he does an excellent job on speaking about some of the things that are going on in our county and Erie County too, in terms of history. He has done many presentations, and the most recent one, I was lucky enough to see him with the Jefferson Society, and it was just excellent. So we are more than happy to have Richard Arthur here. Thank you.
Well, as Jim Thorpe, the famous athlete, used to say when he'd have to give a speech, before I begin my speech, I'd like to say something. I'd like to, first of all, congratulate you as a newly established historical museum that adds to this overall wonderful storytelling that we have throughout northwestern PA. We have some great museums, we have great historical societies, and as you establish yourselves here, I encourage you to think about what's the scope of what you want to do, what stories you want to tell, and expand your membership and curiosity in different directions. I'm going to have a couple of suggestions here for different organizations that one or two of your members might want to join, and then bring the stories that they would have to tell over here to your museum. One of those is the Washington Trail Council, that has a lot of reenactors and a lot of historians, including published authors, that give speeches every April at a summit that's held down in Butler County. These reenactors come from a variety of different places, but it expands into West Virginia, Maryland, and all through Pennsylvania and Western New York. So if you are interested in the period up to and including the Revolutionary War, consider joining that organization. They published this map that I'm going to leave here with you that helps outline the exact routes of Washington's journey. And I would just mention that we do know that Washington came through Little Cooley, which, depending on how far you want to extend your arms and your embrace of your organization, that could be part of the story that you tell here too. Another great organization is, it sounds like it's Erie based, but it really isn't. It includes Erie and Crawford County. And that organization is an organization of organizations. It includes 50 organizations, historical societies, and museums that are located in Erie and Crawford County. And that's called Erie Yesterday, and it's wonderful for gathering ideas. So you usually meet once a month. Sometimes it's on Zoom. Sometimes we actually go to visit one of the museums out there. And I've learned a lot about local history from just going around and touring with them at their local meetings. They share all the information of what's going on in their communities, and that allows you to be ambassadors for a region. So when you get someone here and they have a question, I often get a question at the Eagle. Do you have a historic schoolroom here at our Fort LaBeouf Museum? Nope. But they've really got a great one down in Union City. And then you can refer people there, and then they can have a greater experience. It's amazing how many people come from outside of the region, even sometimes outside of the country, to visit our museum because of the story that we tell. We get people from Quebec and people from France that come in. So it gives you an opportunity to be part of a bigger story. Another organization that you might want to have somebody consider joining is the Archaeological Society that meets, I believe it's based out of Crawford County. And these guys go around and women, they go around and dig up arrowheads and excavate sites professionally and do an excellent job of bringing artifacts into our museums. And these museums, everybody seems to benefit from it. I mean, even Hurry Hill that is dedicated to telling the story of maple syrup. They went out there and did an excavation and found some artifacts and could contribute to their museum, which is really excellent. If you think there's no story to be told from maple syrup, well, go out to Hurry Hill. You'll learn a lot. So there's a lot of opportunity to expand your horizons and be part of that bigger picture. So depending on what your interests might be, you might want to affiliate with one of these or other organizations. And of course, the Crawford County Historical Society has a very nice museum in and of itself. It's nice that they cooperate with you, but I'm sure you'll have a lot of really great stories to tell. My mother-in-law's family came to Crawford County in 1795, and until my mother-in-law passed 2 years ago, there had always been someone from her family living in Crawford County. So I'm just always very interested in your local history as well. And a close affiliation with that. So I just want to congratulate you again on what you've done here to get started, and looking forward. And if there's anything that I can ever do, I'll leave a bunch of business cards up here. If there's anything I can do from Fort LaBeouf or personally to help you with your effort, that's kind of my passion. That's what I do now that I'm retired and not doing anything important. My wife gets frustrated because she'll say, gee, Benny, are you ever home? Are you going to be away for dinner again tonight? And usually there are 4, 5, 6 times a month where I'm not home for dinner because I've got some little expedition or some little trip that I needed to take or some meeting I needed to go to, but it's very enjoyable. And I also would encourage all of you as members to not be afraid to commit to something in your organization. But as all volunteers, they're always afraid, oh my gosh, I'm going to get sucked in and I'm going to be put in charge of something. Well, that is a real threat, but you can always say no. And I think if you're going to reach out to volunteers, it's always good to be able to define what you want them to do. Sometimes you need volunteers for a weekend. Sometimes you need volunteers for 2 or 3 or 4 times a year. Sometimes you need volunteers to commit to an annual program that you want to put a lot of effort into, and then when it's done for a year. So, I think that's one of the greatest barriers to getting volunteers is being able to define what they are and giving them an option so that they don't feel like they're going to be trapped and be put in charge of something where it's going to be a burden, kind of like they did to me and my wife. Today, I basically, Josh called me because he very much wanted to come out here today, but family should always be first, and he forgot that it was his daughter's birthday. Oh, thank goodness I've never made a mistake like that. But he called me up and he said, hey, can you go over and talk? And I said, yeah. So it was kind of on short notice. I like to try to do some research and get something very specific for each one of my audiences. I did not have the opportunity to do that. So I'm basically going to give you a talk that I gave 2 weeks ago at Allegheny College for the Historical Society in Crawford County and for the college. So this is one of my pet topics over the last year. I have dedicated my life to the story of a patriot who was extremely important in getting independence and who was venerated very, very highly in the 19th century. And then, over time, he's kind of been forgotten. So I hope to bring him to life today because next year we'll be celebrating America 250 and we'll all be thinking about our nation's birth. And I'm hoping that all of us out here on what was the frontier at the time will have an opportunity to find some stories that they can tell that will be important about our founding. Today I'm going to talk about a Frenchman who was born in the middle part of France in a noble family of great historical importance in France. But they were out in the middle of nowhere, so they were far from the count of the court of Versailles or the court of Louis XV at the time. The boy was known as Marie Gilbert de Montier, but we call him Layfayette. His father died before he ever had a chance to meet his son. His father was a soldier, and he was serving his king, as their family had for generations, all the way back to the days of Joan of Arc. His mother didn't like living out in the middle of nowhere, so she went off to join the court at Versailles as a noble. She was allowed to do that, and she left young Layfayette in the charge of his grandparents. So he was raised in this small town, and he loved it there because he would organize himself as the man in charge, the noble of the town, and he would get other town boys and he would lead them off to the woods where they would fight monsters, or maybe the British, which he did not like because they killed his father. And life was good for these many years as he was growing up. But around age 11, his grandparents died, and his mother said, it's time you need to come to Paris to become trained as a nobleman. Well, he thought maybe he was going to be able to be trained as a great soldier, but he found out that really training was more along the lines of learning witty conversation, learning how to play cards, learning how to properly ride astride a horse as a nobleman. He would have to learn to dance, and he hated dancing, and he didn't dance very well, and Marie Antoinette used to laugh at him because he was that bad of a dancer. This was not the life he had hoped for. Another aspect of his arrival in court was that when his grandparents died, he became, at age 11, a count, a marquis, one of the highest levels of nobility, and one of the richest people in Europe at age 11. So, what was his fate? Well, his fate was he would get an opportunity to meet all these great people like Rousseau or Voltaire, so he would be part of the Enlightenment. But he would also be fair game for every nobleman there who wanted to marry off his daughters. This is Adrienne, no eyes. Her father decided that would be a good match for young Layfayette, so at age 14, they were married. Now, for the first 2 years they were married, they lived apart because they didn't think they were ready for that level of intimacy. But even though this was an arranged marriage, it would last their entire life. And unlike most of the people in the French noble court who took on mistresses, Layfayette never did. He was loyal and very caring of his wife. At age 17, he was put into a parade unit, not a real soldier unit, just a parade unit so they could parade around the court and look important and impress visitors or whatever. And he wasn't excited about that, but they did send him out to Metz, which is in the eastern part of France, on an expedition to go out, I guess, as a publicity tour for the king. There, he kind of met a man who would change his life. This man was British. Remember, Layfayette didn't like British people, but this was an exception. This man was the Duke of Gloucester. And the Duke of Gloucester was really into the American Revolution that had just started across the ocean. He told Layfayette and his friends about stories about the American Revolution and how it's going to change things around the world and how they're going to have a concept called liberty, which, strange as it seems to us, they really hadn't thought much of that. The idea of having people make their own decisions and be free was really not something you even thought of as a Frenchman or an Englishman in the 18th century. He told stories about this heroic figure named George Washington. And he said, this man will change the course of human history. And Lafayette and his friends were absolutely captivated, and they said, I've got to run off, go to America, and be part of this. Oh, let me tell you something about the Duke of Gloucester. This man who changed Lafayette's life, he was the brother of King George III. Lafayette goes off to Paris, meets with American diplomats. They write a letter of recommendation back to Benjamin Franklin, and Franklin sends it back to Philadelphia to the Congress, the Continental Congress. And they say, we really need this guy named Lafayette. Why do we need him? Did he have any military experience? No. But he was rich, he was powerful, and he had some influence. And they thought, that is something we probably could use. So this glowing recommendation allowed Lafayette to consider buying his own ship, outfitting his own group of soldiers, and trying to get away from France. Now, the King of France had a bunch of officers already leave and go to America. And he was concerned about this trend, so he made a rule that no French officers would be allowed to leave France. So Lafayette had to sneak out. So he went through all kinds of back alleys, and he went to Spain, and he traveled all through different places in disguise to try to throw off these henchmen that the king had sent to go and find Lafayette. So Lafayette gets on his ship eventually down in Bordeaux. He gets it ready to sail, and he sneaks out of town just as the posse arrives to arrest him and keep him in France. And they get to see the sails of the ship sinking over the horizon as Lafayette gets ready to travel to America. What happens when he's on the ship? He doesn't speak any English, so he thought, well, maybe I'd better try to learn a little English while I'm here. He really had never had any formal military training, so he brought along some books on tactics. And he thought, I'll learn this when I'm on the ship. Unfortunately, when he was on the ship, he was seasick most of the time. They were trying to avoid the British, who would like to take him for ransom, the King of France, who wanted to bring him back, and pirates that were always out in the ocean causing trouble. So they kind of had to sneak and be discreet as they traveled. Oh, I forgot to tell you, he left France without telling his pregnant wife. Now, I think he did this because he didn't want her to be compromised and be able to tell where he had gone. So he writes this letter of apology to his wife that he will send back once he gets into the States. Dear heart, it is from very far away I'm writing you. Have you forgiven me by now? Soldier of freedom, the freedom I idolize, I come as a friend to offer my help to this very interesting republic, bringing with me only my sincerity and my goodwill. I have no desire for personal gain. I don't think that was necessarily true. But by my laboring for my glory, I labor for their happiness. Now, this next paragraph, he's going to be talking about a place that he has never been. The happiness of America is intimately tied to the happiness of all humanity. America will become the respected and secure haven of virtue, tolerance, equality, and peaceful freedom. He wrote this when he was 19 years old, about a country he'd never been to, and for the rest of his life, he will never vary off this path. He is completely Americanized and loyal to the American cause from this day forward. So he travels up to Philadelphia, and the getting there from Georgetown, South Carolina was not easy. He bought a carriage and it fell apart. Then he got a wagon and it fell apart. Then he rode a horse for a while. And he kind of arrives in Philadelphia on foot. And he goes after all this trouble of sneaking out of France, getting seasick, making this very difficult voyage to Philadelphia. He goes to the Congress, and the Congress receives him how? Do you remember the scene in The Wizard of Oz where Dorothy and her entourage arrive at the Emerald City, and they knock on the door, the man with the fuzzy hat comes out and says, "Go away! Go away!" That's what they did. They tried to tell him to go away. They had French, Prussian, even English officers show up to help, and they were always bad news. But John Hancock, who was the president of the Congress, had that letter that Benjamin Franklin had sent and given to him. And it outlined Lafayette's contributions. First of all, he was willing to serve without pay. That was very important. He had come to learn, not to teach. That was a different attitude than most other officers. Oh, and he brought with him 80,000 pounds to give to the cause of the revolution. So now to continue my metaphor, that's a horse of a different color. That got him in the door. So Hancock arranges what I would consider to be the most important event as an interpersonal relationship in American history. This is the date that Lafayette met Washington in Philadelphia at City Tavern. This will cement the glue that will hold things together and allow America to eventually win the Revolutionary War. Now, when Lafayette first met Washington, he was very impressed. That is no story because everyone who met George Washington was immediately impressed with him. His bearing, his voice, his everything. What's really interesting is how did Washington perceive Lafayette? Washington was always very skeptical of these foreign officers coming in. But, and here's the secret about our father of our country. He was a clothes horse. He was very, very impressed with uniforms. And Lafayette had a much better uniform than anybody else in that room that night. And that's training that he got at the court of Versailles about standing correctly and riding a horse correctly and having good manners and making witty conversation. Well, that had an impact too. So Washington said, I'm going to look out for you. I'm going to keep you close. And Lafayette got all excited because he thought he was going to be given a prestigious command right away. But Washington had a little more sense than that. He knew this guy didn't know anything yet. So he said, well, I'm going to put you on my staff. Now, this is an interesting thing. Washington had no natural children. Lafayette had never known his father. So can we see where this is going? This is the basis of their relationship. Washington always treated Lafayette as more or less an adopted son, almost from the very beginning. They also had another important thing in common. Lafayette wanted to serve his king, but the king wasn't interested in him. He just put him in a parade unit. So he was dismissed. Washington wanted to serve his king, the British king. And through the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, he had done nothing but taken on all these responsibilities and just done all the work anyone could ever ask of him. And he was told, oh, we don't need you, Washington. You're just a colonial. You will never be one of us. So they were both dismissed, and they were both missing a part of their family. And that cemented their relationship. So Washington says, I'm going to put you on my staff. But he used the British word for a general staff. And that word was, I'm going to put you on my family. Okay, if you're Lafayette, you are not real familiar with English, let alone maybe nuances like this, you think, oh, I'm going to be like his son. I'm going to be part of his family. So he might very well have misunderstood what Washington was offering initially. Washington eventually would offer all of that and more to Lafayette. Lafayette wanted a command. He wanted to be in the action, and he would have to just wait because he was going to be on the staff. And he had to wait a whole 5 weeks because Washington was in trouble defending Philadelphia at a place called Brandywine Creek. Brandywine Creek is southwest of Philadelphia. They set up a good little defensive position there, and things were going pretty well until a Quaker family that sympathized with the British told the British officers, oh, well, you can go down there a little ways and you can cross over the Brandywine Creek. It's a nice, easy ford, and you can come in and you can flank Washington's troops and create chaos and probably defeat him. George Washington's biographer, who was always very appreciative of Washington's skills, almost in awe, never said anything bad about him, but he said on this day that Washington was in a panic. So there were things going on with the British coming around and flanking Washington's troops, and you can imagine the chaos and what was going on there were just tremendously frightening to Washington. Lafayette seized the moment in what I call a put me in their coach type exchange. He goes to Washington and said, I'll get down there and correct what's going on in that flank. And Washington's probably going, okay, well, go ahead. He didn't really expect anything. Lafayette goes down in broken English and rallies the troops, gets them organized, saves that flank. And although Brandywine was not really an American victory, neither was it an American defeat. Washington was able to save his army because of what Lafayette did on his one flank. Now, Lafayette continued to lead, even though at the time, well, where do I go there? No signal.
Is it still plugged into the computer?
I think so.
Here, you got it.
Lafayette was able to do this even though he was wounded during this battle. He was shot in the leg and he continued to rally his troops. So I think he was very, very impressive. Nathaniel Greene, who was Washington's probably his best general, said, you can't spare Lafayette. This man runs to the action and he knows how to fight. He is fearless. Washington was very impressed. Washington turns to his surgeon and says, take care of this man as if he were my son. There, the relationship is fixed. And it continues, and Lafayette recovers, and he comes back, and in New Jersey basically does the same thing at Guilford Courthouse, or not Monmouth Courthouse, and again leads troops in a place where things were collapsing. It takes over and does a great job. That day, which was the longest single-day battle in the Revolution, where it was very, very hot, that was the one where Molly Pitcher was out helping the troops. Washington lays down his cloak, as he often did, to go to bed. He lays down there, he's almost completely exhausted, and he lays down, and he turns to Lafayette and he said, hey, come on over here, you can sleep over here beside me. General Greene said he never extended that degree of intimacy to anyone except to Lafayette. So they had a very, very special relationship. Washington shared all the hardships with Lafayette and Valley Forge. He went through all of the challenges of that. And then when he was finished, he was sent back to France as a diplomat. The hope was he was going to be able to go back and get more help from the French to help turn the tide in the Revolution. The whole time that he is gone in France, visitors occasionally come to Washington's headquarters who have returned from France. And he always goes and asks the first question, did you see Lafayette over there? And one officer said, oh, yes, I did, and he was a very fine man. He said some nice things. And Washington grabbed his hands and shook like he was a father proud of his own son. As the revolution turned to 1781, near the end of the revolution, there was a very, very important battle that most of us never hear about, fought off the coast of Virginia, down close to Norfolk. This is called the Battle of the Capes, and this is a battle between the French Navy, which had been called in to help, with Lafayette's help, and the British Navy. Now, normally during this time period, an encounter between the British Navy and the French Navy resulted in having the British clean the clock of the French. But not this time. The French Navy prevailed, and it was able to bottle up the forces at Yorktown and set the stage for eventually the surrender of the British forces in North America. At the ceremony, the British very much wanted to surrender and give their their sword over to Lafayette instead of to the American troops that were also lined up over there. Because after all, the French were a real country, and Lafayette was an officer from a real country. And he refused the sword and insisted that they have to humble themselves and turn the sword over to colonials, which obviously they did not recognize as an independent country at that time. Lafayette played a role in the French Revolution. I'm not going to bore you today with any stories about the French Revolution. I'll just summarize it this way. There were a bunch of crazy people on the right. There were a bunch of crazy people on the left. They took turns being in charge, and when they were in charge, they cut each other's heads off. There were people in the middle that were trying very, very hard to establish what I would call a constitutional monarchy. Now, believe it or not, this is what Lafayette tried to encourage the French people to do, which was build a government much like they had in England, which he thought would work because he wasn't radical enough to want to do away with the monarchy. He wrote, along with Thomas Jefferson, a set of principles called the Rights of Humans. And this became, years later, the basis of the French Constitution, but they didn't want to hear about it in the 1780s and 1790s. So he was kind of the man in the middle. In times of political chaos, there's no more dangerous place than being in the middle, because everybody hates you. So there was a point at which Lafayette felt his life was in danger. He sent his son to America so George Washington could keep him at Mount Vernon and keep him close and under surveillance and safe. And he ran away to save his own life to Prussia. And he thought Prussia would be okay. They'd take care of him. But the Prussian king said, oh no, you're anti-king, so I'm going to have to slap you in chains and put you in jail, which is exactly what he did. So for 5 years, Lafayette was in prison in Prussia, basically because of his moderate political views. His wife and daughters wanted to be with him so much that they willingly put themselves in prison with him over that time frame. They were more concerned about being separated than they were about being free. So I think that says a lot about his devotion to his family. After the Revolution, Lafayette continued to establish that close relationship with George Washington, and he visited him at Mount Vernon for an extended period of time. he wrote back to his wife, who stayed in France, a lot about the time in Mount Vernon. We learn about George Washington. We know, for example, that at Mount Vernon, he liked to have children present and running around. And he said in France, they always, box the children up and send them off to their room or whatever, and they were never seen during public exchanges like this. And he just thought this was the greatest thing, that Washington, as the grandpa, would allow these kids to run around. So Martha had children from her first marriage. They were there, and there were neighborhood children who came, and as well as nieces and nephews. So when you think of the father of our country, you can also think of the grandfather of our country, because he was very, very much like that. When you look at the dollar bill, you don't think about him being a family guy, but he was. We also know that he attended to his business and agriculture and industry with a great deal of attention. So Lafayette writes back and says, Washington gets up early, has breakfast, is on his horse riding around Mount Vernon and checking on all kinds of things all the time. That was really his passion. I think he probably would have rather been a farmer or even a craftsman than be a general or president. We also learned that he liked chicken and ham a lot. There was one issue, though, on which Lafayette and Washington had very different opinions. Washington, of course, held slaves and had a very, very extensive operation at Mount Vernon, where it was both industry, where they made robe and whiskey and other things like that, as well as plantation of tobacco. Lafayette's idea of liberty was unalloyed. He believed everybody should be free. So he goes to Washington and says, hey, how about this? Why don't you and I have a plantation? We'll buy a plantation, and we'll bring in some slaves, and we'll train them in trade. So they can learn how to make furniture, how they can learn how to make whiskey, how they can learn leather crafting or whatever was necessary. And Washington's reply was, that's very interesting. It's a little bit of a wild proposition. And Lafayette said, well, if it's wild, I'd rather be wild this way than wild the other way. So Washington says, well, the next time we meet, we'll talk about this. Obviously, Washington had very conflicted ideas about slavery himself. He had soldiers who were black. He had spies, extensive spy network. A lot of them were slaves. And he freed all of his slaves on his death. But they never had an opportunity to meet after this, so they never had an opportunity to discuss the proposition. Okay, now I'm going to jump forward here to 1824. By now, all of the generals from the American Army have died, with one exception, and that's Lafayette. Probably because he started his career at age 19. But he's still alive in 1824, and the President of the United States is getting ready to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the United States. So just like next year we are getting ready to celebrate that same anniversary, this was the first time they were going to do that on a large scale. The President was James Monroe. Oh, and I didn't mention, you saw that picture of him being wounded at Brandywine? The guy who came to pick him up was Lieutenant James Monroe, who was able to speak French and was able to help Lafayette in that. So now he's president, and he goes to Congress and says, let's send a ship over to France, and we'll get Lafayette, we'll bring him over here. Well, at that time, Lafayette had lost his fortune, he'd lost his title, and he was widowed. But he did have his son, George Washington Lafayette, and the two of them came over at our expense and took on a little bit of a tour of the country. Now, when he first arrives in New York City, is where he arrives, the crowd that greets him is far larger than the population of New York. And this is true just about everywhere he goes, because these people were only a generation or two removed from the Revolution. They knew the significance of his contribution. And people were very, very excited. People were screaming, I saw him, I touched him, I saw him with my own eyes. Lafayette was just, it was that kind of an experience for people. Talk about ticker tape parades. This one went on for a long time. Everywhere he went, he would get long political speeches. There would be arches of flowers. There would be band bands. There would be armies of little girls wearing white dresses carrying flowers. Everywhere he went, people could not do enough for Lafayette. The visit is really very extensive. We'll just talk about what happened when he came to Western Pennsylvania. He came up the Ohio River on a barge, having been down south and visited every state, all 24 states. He came up from the south, and the Ohio River, the barge that he was on sank. And everyone on the barge was rescued by George Washington Lafayette. And unfortunately, he lost his cane that Washington had given him. It was a cane they often said was almost never out of his grip. But he survived to make it to Wheeling, Virginia, because it was Virginia at the time. And then he got on the National Road, and he liked to see improvements in America. That was very exciting to him. So seeing the National Road was really very important. And he goes to visit his friend Albert Gallatin, who was the former Secretary of the Treasury and a diplomat that he knew in France. Gallatin was a Swiss immigrant, so they shared that experience as well. You notice that he goes to Fayette County, one of hundreds of places that are named, from Lafayette, Louisiana, to different places, across the country. If it says Fayette, if it says LaGrange, if it says Lafayette, it was all a tribute to him. He goes to Pittsburgh, and he's down there for a couple days, and they, again, do the whole thing with the big portraits and a big parade, and the girls with the flowers and a dance. The last night he's in Pittsburgh, he stays at the home of a diplomat who lived in a house that's basically down almost where the baseball stadium is in Pittsburgh. The next morning they get on the everyday mail stagecoach. Nothing glamorous, just the stagecoach. And the mayor of Pittsburgh, Lafayette, and Lafayette's son and his secretary ride up to Butler. And you can see this 1840s picture on the left, the building that was there where he had his lunch. We know that he ate a tremendous amount of sauerkraut on an occasion. And typically, he would greet and meet anyone who would come up to him. He shook over 400 hands in Butler that day. We know that for a fact. What often happened, and this happened, and it tells us a lot about Lafayette's personality. People would come up to him and they'd say, I was there at Brandywine when you were shot. I mean, this happened like 20 times over his trip. I was there when you were shot. I remember. And he would always turn to them and say, ah, yes, I remember you. He couldn't say anything bad about anybody who had anything to do with his independence. The building on the right is where that is located today. And it's called the Lafayette Building, and you can see it's kind of built in the French style. The DAR rededicated a plaque down there about 2 weeks ago. Then he went to Mercer. He went to stay in this hotel, which no longer is standing. A couple years later, it burned down. And when it was burning down, the proprietor of the hotel went up to the room where Lafayette had stayed, and he picked up Lafayette's bed and tried to throw it out the window, but it wouldn't fit. So he chopped it into pieces, keep in mind, the building's on fire at this point. He's chopped it up in pieces and threw it out the window so it could be reconstituted. And if you go down to the Mercer County Historical Society today, you can see the bed that Lafayette stayed in. They also dedicated a plaque down there about 2 weeks ago. Then he came up to Meadville. When he came to Meadville, there was a place called the Sign of the Stag, and it was down approximately on Water and Chestnut Street, kind of close to where the mall, the downtown mall is today. I think actually more appropriately for those of you who are old enough to remember, there used to be a bank on the south side of that intersection, along with the Crawford store and Montgomery Ward's, no, it was W.T. Graham. Yes. Remember your past and know where you worked when you were a teenager. Okay. He had a tea there, and they have a set of the tea, silver set, at the Crawford County Historical Society. You can go over and see. It's very elaborate, very nice. And it's a very nice memento of remembering that he came through. Typically, people kept stuff. You know, they treasured these little mementos. Then he went up the hill that afternoon. He went to Allegheny College, and he signed a guest book. And over the right, you can see where he signed Lafayette. George Washington Lafayette and Levasseur, his secretary, signed that. And he gave a set of remarks to the faculty and student body at Allegheny. I mentioned history disappearing. Okay, I went to college there, and for 4 years, this 9-foot-high monument was right in my path where I walked by every day, but it was completely covered by vegetation. I never saw it, didn't know it was there. But it talks about Lafayette's visit, it talks about George Washington's 1753 visit, and it's one of those situations where, because of neglect or whatever, stories are lost. I'm happy to note that I talked to the college about a year ago, and they re-landscaped it, and now it's very visible and very nice, so you can see it. But that's a little bit of the plaque down there where they mentioned his visit in Washington. He went up that night to Waterford, and he stayed, on the left you see the Judson House, which is there today. Beside the Judson House is the post office, and that is where Lafayette stayed that night. In the morning, his host, who was William King, a veteran who actually did serve with Lafayette, introduced him to his son Thomas King, who was building the Eagle Hotel across the street. So people ask, the Eagle Hotel, I said, well, did Washington stay here? No, but he slept on the ground outside there. Did Lafayette stay here? No, but he was the building inspector. He left from there. He had a cavalry escort up to Federal Hill, which, is the place where kind of Peach Street and State Street kind of split in here. And from there all the way down to the waterfront, which was mostly woods at the time, there were people. Where these people came from, nobody knows. I mean, they must have come from far, far away for such a large gathering to assemble in Erie. But just like everywhere else in America, he was welcomed with open arms and great enthusiasm. The Historical Society up in Erie has also a collection of mementos. One I like is a little girl's bonnet that had been made for the occasion, and she was one of those little girls that were always present at these affairs, and it's been preserved and kept. Also, they kept the tablecloth. Now, I think this is interesting. They constructed a table that was 200 feet long, where all the VIPs would sit and I guess have lunch with Lafayette. At the end, Colonel Colt, who was one of the hosts of the event, picked up the tablecloth and kept it as a family memento, but it's now in the Hagen History Center. There's a coffee stain on there, but nobody ever bothered to wash the coffee stain off because that was Lafayette that spilled the coffee, and they wanted to know where he had sat. That was the level of adoration, I guess you'd say at the time, and respect. This is the toast that he gave to the city of Erie. This is typical. He gave very short toasts, very short speeches, but always with great enthusiasm and great patriotism, and always wishing the best for America. Now, he left Erie and he had an appointment that he wanted to make. On the 4th of July, he wanted to be at Bunker Hill. So in order to get to Bunker Hill in Massachusetts, he had to go up on and use part of the Erie Canal and travel along, kind of along I-90, I guess, up along that route. But he did make it to Bunker Hill in time to work with Daniel Webster, and the two of them broke the ground for the Washington Monument that occurred, not the Washington Monument, the Bunker Hill Monument that exists on Bunker Hill. You can see that today, but at the time, you know, they did this thing, you know. You always see in the news, you know, the guys aren't the, you know, take the shovel and breaking the ground and cutting a ribbon. Lafayette had an empty cask, and he filled that empty cask with American soil and shipped that back to France with him. He felt that level of devotion to his second country. I had a book that a friend of mine gave me. It was, I don't know where he found it, and he gave it to me like it was almost a throwaway, but it was actually a contemporary book printed in 1825 that talked about Lafayette's travels. At the very end, I loved this quote because it tells us so much about how he was honored at the time. The hero of these memoirs has displayed a triumph unparalleled in the annals of the world. Not only the triumph of the hero, the patriot, and the philanthropist alone, but the triumph of principles, integrity, and virtue. Through all the extremes of prosperity and adversity, from the summit of popular power to 5 long years of imprisonment under the iron hand of despotism, always true to himself, he remains unsullied with any touch of dishonor. And that's basically the way that man lived his life. Jump forward now to 1917. American troops have arrived in France. General Pershing takes his staff over to Lafayette's grave, and you probably have heard that one of the members of his staff said, "Lafayette, we are here," as if we are repaying a debt. What you probably don't appreciate is, you see those flowers in the far right corner down there? Those are growing in American soil that Lafayette brought back in that cask. I left other people with this assignment. I think it's very important. So when you're having a dinner table conversation next year about American history, as I'm sure you all will, don't disappoint me. I want you to consider asking this question: what makes a founding father? And it could be that it's a diplomat like Benjamin Franklin, did a very important service to our country. Could be a financier like Robert Morris, who basically, when they said the Declaration of Independence, pledged our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor, he basically pledged his fortune. He died a poor man, having given so much of his money to our cause. Could be a military hero like Nathaniel Greene, or one of the many other military heroes we had. Or it could be a political thinker like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. Each of these men had distinguished themselves in one of these areas, and some of them maybe even in 2. But can you consider, or can you think of anybody who might have been a diplomat, a financier, a military hero, and a political philosopher? Well, of course you can. I introduced you to him this morning. So I make my case that this is a founding father. I thank you for your time.
Do you have any questions? Do you have any questions about the time period or any? I'll be glad to take them. Yes, ma'am.
When he first came, he was 19. How old was George Washington at the time?
George Washington, let's see. When 1775 he took command of the army, he would have been he would have been 35.
He always looked very old in the photos.
Well, you know, consider the stress that he went through. I mean, he had this long drawn out war. It was long and drawn out by design because he knew that was the key to winning, was get the British to just give up. But every one of those days, I'm sure he was worried. He had challenges to his leadership. He had people that wanted to throw him out. It's unreasonable. He really liked the life back on the farm, but he didn't get to do it very often. And then, of course, they put him on the Constitutional Convention. So he had all the arbitration that would have been necessary to get these people with 13 different colonies had very different needs and desires. And he kind of, it's funny, at the Constitutional Convention, he didn't say much. Except in the evening when they would meet, he would talk to them individually. Or during the proceedings, somebody bring up an idea and he'd make a face. Like, no, we don't want to do that. So you really did have an important. Then of course he had to invent the role of president because they really didn't tell him. There was no model. There was no model. So
Did they want him to be king? He said no. President with the term.
He didn't want that. You know, that's what we went to war against. When the word went back to King George that after the war Washington had considered retiring and not taking a position, George III said, he's the greatest man in the world. Because he had that much respect for anybody that would turn over that. It's kind of amazing.
It was amazing. Well, I cannot thank you enough, Richard, for being our special guest today. And
My pleasure.
yeah, I
like
really
what
like
you're doing here.
learning about Lafayette. And I want to say thanks to the team too, because this really is the second speaker series. John and Rita are here. They did the first one. But to Vicki, Ann Bergheim, Mitzi, Beckwith, Judy, Amon, who's not here today, Frank Snyder, and Debbie Pritchard, Kim Miller, and Molly Shree. So those are the folks that are really helping us out. And we got internet from S Buyers, our internet supplier, so we're really thrilled about that. And you'll see more things coming along, and I hope you all come to our big lunch party. It's next Saturday, and it's at noon. We'll have light refreshments. We're gonna have the ribbon cutting and to celebrate what we have done here for this wonderful center. So I'm really happy that you all came today, and if you have any more questions for Richard, please come on up.
Yeah, I'll leave some business cards here.
Okay.
I talk a lot, and my wife said I talk too much.
Richard, would you like to draw our prize for today?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
and it'll be clean because I don't have a ticket.
Oh.
At the Washington Trail Council, my wife made a gift basket, and we had like 20 different gift baskets. Ours, it was one of those where you drop your tickets in.
Yeah.
Oh, we had by far the biggest ticket.
Oh.
Yeah. I should have known that. I would have brought it up. Okay.
Just
And
read the number.
the great number is 871, which I'm sure you all are. 074.
074.
B26.
Bingo.
074.
Back here.
Oh, good. All right.
Yeah, and I'm willing
willing to talk to nursing homes or any school groups, homeschool groups, you know, anything. The thing is, it's about telling the story, not about the size of the audience.
Yeah, well, this was good today.
Yes, it was very good. There's a lot of things going on today. at other places.
Yeah, I'm AWOL from a fundraiser for the Fort Lovelace.
Oh,
Oh, that's the other thing. Union City's having a blueberry cobbler
back.
greeting thing tomorrow. So they want everybody to come. It's from noon to 2.
Union City Museum.
Yeah, the Union City Museum. Can you guys hear when somebody just talks?